Hey guys, tonight we step back into a world where your blanket is made of scratchy wool, the wind howls through the gaps in your walls, and the only insulation between you and a frostbitten night is, well, let's just say hope is on the list. Imagine waking up at midnight to find your breath hanging in the air like a ghost, your toes curled so tightly they might just fuse together. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, you're safe in your own bed right now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie there in the dark, inside a thatched roof cottage where the roof beams creak under the weight of snow. The wind outside hisses like 1,000 whispers, and every so often a gust sneaks through the thin wattle and daub walls. Even the straw stuffed in the cracks seems to sigh, as if it's given up trying to keep the cold out. This is the Middle Ages, and you're a peasant, which means you don't have glass windows, just wooden shutters. And right now, those shutters are rattling like they're trying to break free. Your home is a single room shared by the whole family, maybe a few animals, and a stubborn, smoky smell from the day's fire. The floor is bare earth, hard and uneven, and the frost creeping through it feels like a silent invader under your feet. You reach for your cloak, not a fancy fur-trimmed noble's cloak, but a coarse wool thing that's been patched so many times it has more personality than style. You drape it over yourself, pulling it tight, but still the cold bites through. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually felt used to the cold or just endured it year after year, the same way you might endure a toothache that never quite goes away. There's a small loft above, where some families store grain, but it's also where the warm air tries to hide. Not that much of it exists. To keep the chill at bay, you've stuffed every hole in the thatch with moss and scraps of cloth. If you're lucky, your cottage faces away from the prevailing wind. If not, well, tonight is going to feel very long. The fire, earlier in the day, gave the illusion of comfort, but with the embers now reduced to a faint orange glow, you understand the cruel truth. Heat in a medieval home is like a shy animal. It lingers only if you feed it constantly. A quirky detail here, some folks actually hung animal hides along the inside walls, not for decoration, but as an extra layer against drafts. It wasn't pretty, and it made the place smell like a wet barn when the hides got damp, but it was better than letting the wind whistle over your bed. You roll over, pulling the rough blanket tighter, and think of what tomorrow brings. Chopping frozen wood with numb fingers, fetching water from a pond with a surface you'll have to break through, and trying not to slip on ice while carrying it home. Survival isn't dramatic here. It's a quiet, relentless test. The thatch above holds secrets from decades past, bits of lost tools, a bird's nest or two, maybe even a mummified rat flattened by centuries of dust. Every groan of the roof makes you wonder if the snow will hold or slide off in the night. And then there's the sound, the constant hush of winter wind meeting the stubborn resistance of your home's fragile frame. Sometimes it's gentle, almost like the sea in the distance, lulling you into a false sense of security. Other times, it rattles every loose board, sending a reminder that you're only a few thin walls away from the full force of nature. Still, you manage. You've learned the art of tucking your feet into the hollow behind your knees, curling into the smallest shape possible to conserve warmth. You've even mastered the trick of holding your breath for a moment to let the blanket trap the faint heat your body produces. It's not much, but in the dead of winter, not much can mean the difference between shivering through the night and actually sleeping. The cold here isn't just a temperature, it's a presence. You feel it pressing against you from all sides, creeping through seams, finding the tiniest flaw in your defenses. And yet, somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. Life goes on. Even in the grip of winter, you hear the quiet shifting of your neighbors, the occasional creak of someone tending a fire in the dark hours, the faint hiss of snow sliding off a roof. you pull the cloak higher over your face and drift toward that half-sleep where you're still aware of every sound. Somewhere in your mind, you make a note to collect more moss for the wall cracks tomorrow, maybe even beg a scrap of old linen from a neighbor. It's not much of a plan, but in the medieval winter, small plans are sometimes all that stand between you and the cold, silent victory. You wake before dawn, not because you want to, but because your nose is cold enough to feel like it might snap off. The blanket has slipped just enough to expose your face, and the air bites at you like a stray cat that doesn't want to be touched. Outside, the sky is still an unbroken sheet of black, and inside, the darkness is so complete you can't see your own hands. You can, however, feel the coarseness of the wool wrapped around you, scratchy, stiff, and smelling faintly of sheep no matter how many years it's been in your family. This is the first line of defense. Layers. Not just one or two, but so many that you start to feel like you're wearing the entire inventory of a medieval market stall. You slide your arms inside your cloak and under your tunic, trying to keep every inch of skin from meeting the air. Wool on wool, linen underneath, maybe some patched-up hose if you're lucky. The fashion statement here isn't style, it's, "Please don't let me freeze solid before breakfast." You sit up, pulling a second tunic over the first. It's one of those hand-me-downs that's been mended so many times, the stitches form a road map of someone's life, a sleeve replaced here, a tear sewn there. And here's the funny part. Medieval people often wore their best layers to bed, because taking them off would mean surrendering what little heat they'd built up during the day. Historians still argue whether peasants actually owned much in the way of extra clothing, or if layering just meant wearing every rag you possessed at the same time. But the principle remained. More cloth between you and the cold meant more survival. The only trouble? Laundry. Washing these wool garments in winter wasn't just inconvenient. It was almost impossible. Wet wool takes forever to dry, and if it freezes before it does, you've just created medieval chainmail made entirely out of ice. Sometimes you add fur into the mix, not the glamorous fox or sable you imagine from noble portraits, but rabbit, squirrel, or even cat. Yes, cat. Peasant life didn't have the same sentimental rules we keep today, and warmth outranked morality when it came to surviving January. Over your head, you pull a coif, a small linen cap that keeps your ears from becoming frost sculptures. Some folks also wrap their necks in long strips of cloth, a peasant's version of a scarf. Hands are trickier. Mittens are rare luxuries, so you might keep your sleeves long enough to bunch over your fingers or shove your hands deep into your tunic, pressed against your ribs for warmth. There's a curious detail you've heard from travelers. In certain villages, people wore layers so thick that falling into water was more dangerous because the soaked fabric could drag you under before you even had the strength to pull yourself out. It's one of those odd medieval hazards you'd never think about until you live here. You stand now, shivering as the cold instantly attacks the gap between your socks and your hose. The floor is freezing, earth so hard it could pass for stone. Some folks line their floors with rushes, straw, or even old cloth scraps to make a barrier between toes and frost. It's not elegant, but the alternative is frostbite in your own home. Layering isn't just about clothing, it's a philosophy. You've seen neighbors stuff straw into their outer garments for insulation, turning themselves into walking scarecrows. It looks absurd, but when the wind howls and the temperature drops, pride is a luxury no one can afford. You throw on a patched outer cloak, heavier than the others, and secure it with a wooden pin. Cloak pins are simple tools, but in winter they're as essential as the cloak itself. A loose garment that flaps in the wind is worse than no cloak at all. It invites the cold in, lets it dance over your skin like it owns the place. The truth is, every layer you wear adds minutes to your endurance outside. Without them, your fingers stiffen, your lips crack, and your teeth chatter so violently you start worrying about breaking them. With them, you can manage, not comfortably, but long enough to gather firewood, tend animals, or trudge to the village well without collapsing. And here's where the strange practicality of medieval life shows itself. Your layers aren't just for you. When you come back inside, that heat you've been hoarding in your clothing will spill into the air around your bed, helping warm the tiny bubble of space where your family sleeps. It's like carrying a portable furnace, one that runs on your own body heat. So you bundle tighter, tucking one garment into another, sealing every gap you can find. The cold is patient, waiting for the smallest weakness in your defenses. But you've learned its tricks. You know how to fight back with cloth, with fur, with whatever you can scavenge. And when you finally step outside into the pre-dawn frost, you feel it press against your layers, testing them, like an enemy probing a castle wall. And for now at least, you hold your ground. The cold has a sound. You hear it the moment you step outside. That faint crystalline crunch beneath your boots, the whisper of icy air threading through bare branches. But here in the medieval village, you don't walk far without heading toward the center of your universe, the hearth. Fire isn't just warmth, it's survival wrapped in smoke and sparks. Your home's hearth is low to the ground, a simple pit or raised stone slab with blackened walls that have soaked up years of heat and soot. There's no neat metal grate, no polished chimney, just a hole in the roof where smoke grudgingly escapes, curling upward in ghostly ribbons. The air inside is always hazy, a mix of wood smoke and whatever you cooked last night. You crouch by the embers, nudging them with an iron poker, though in truth, it might just be a stick you charred at one end. Red coals glow faintly, holding on to life like tired fireflies. This is the most precious time, keeping last night's fire alive so you don't have to waste kindling starting from scratch. Historians still argue whether most peasants could afford to keep their fire going day and night, or if fuel shortages forced them to let it die between uses. Either way, tending the embers before sunrise is a ritual. You add a few sticks, coaxing the flames to lick upward. It's a careful dance, too much wood too fast, and you smother the heat, too little, and the cold wins. In winter, every household smells of smoke. It clings to your clothes, your hair, even your skin. Some travelers say they can smell a medieval village before they see it. And it's not all cozy. The smoke can sting your eyes, leaving them red and streaming, and too much inhaled over a lifetime leaves your lungs protesting like stubborn mules. You remember a neighbor's quirky trick. They'd place a flat stone right beside the hearth, warming it all day. At night, that stone would be wrapped in cloth and tucked into bed like a primitive hot water bottle. It worked, but only for a while. By morning, the stone was just another cold lump under the blankets. Fire also dictates where you spend your time. In summer, you might wander in and out of the house freely. In winter, the fire becomes an anchor, drawing you close, keeping you in its glow. Even the animals appreciate it. The family cat sprawls dangerously close to the edge, tail flicking every so often to remind you it owns the warmest spot in the room. Fuel is a constant worry. Wood must be chopped and stacked well before winter arrives, because frozen logs are stubborn, and trudging through snow to find kindling is a miserable task. Some families burn peat, dark, compact blocks cut from marshlands, which smolder with a distinctive earthy smell. Others gather dried dung, which surprisingly burns longer than you'd expect. You don't talk about the smell, you just appreciate the heat. The hearth isn't just a place for warmth, it's the kitchen, the workshop, and the family gathering spot. You eat beside it, mend clothes beside it, tell stories and whisper gossip there. Light in winter comes mostly from its flames, casting everything in a shifting amber glow. Faces look softer in firelight, even tired faces, even cold ones. But the fire has limits. The heat fades quickly the further you sit from it, and the back of your body still feels the chill no matter how much the front is toasty. That's why people huddle close together, turning occasionally like meat on a spit to warm evenly. And here's a little-known hazard. Medieval fires rarely burn clean. Sparks jump without warning, and you've seen more than one blanket or tunic develop a mysterious hole overnight. That's why some folks hang a damp cloth nearby, ready to slap down on any ember that decides to go exploring. When the flames finally catch and the room brightens, you feel that subtle shift. Not warmth exactly, but the promise of warmth. Your fingers unclench, your shoulders drop slightly. The fire isn't roaring, but it's enough to make you believe you can face the day. You know you'll be back here in just a few hours, stomping snow from your boots, holding your palms out to the heat, letting it seep into your bones. In winter, the hearth isn't just a part of the home. It is the home. Everything else is just walls keeping the wind away. You retreat from the fire only when you absolutely have to, and even then, it's to go to the second most important place in the house, the bed. Bed is a generous word here. It's really a low wooden frame, if you're lucky, stacked with straw, rushes, and maybe an old feather mattress if your family's done well. More often, it's just a heap of straw on the floor, pushed into the corner where two walls meet, so the wind has fewer sides to attack you from. The straw isn't exactly soft. You can feel the stalks poking through the thin linen sheet covering them, and every so often you have to stand up and shake out the bed to send the mice running. The smell is earthy, like a barn, which makes sense, because it's basically the same material used in the barn, but it's better than lying directly on the hard, cold earth. And then there's the great unspoken truth of the medieval bed. You rarely sleep in it alone. Privacy is a luxury you can't afford, and body heat is worth more than modesty. Your bedmates might be your spouse, your children, a visiting cousin, or even an elderly neighbor if they have no family of their own. It's a jumble of limbs and blankets where you learn to sleep while people breathe inches from your face. Historians still argue whether this communal sleeping was purely practical or if it also carried a cultural sense of closeness. But one thing is certain. When the outside world feels like an icebox, more bodies mean more warmth. You've learned to curl your knees into someone's back, to tangle your feet together under the covers, to steal whatever heat you can without waking anyone. The blankets are heavy, woven wool, thick and slightly damp from the constant cold. On top of that, you might have a fur throw, patched from scraps so that no two pieces match in color or texture. Sometimes people layer old cloaks or even spare tunics over the bedding for extra insulation. The goal isn't comfort, it's survival until sunrise. And here's where medieval ingenuity shines, the bed warming tools. If you're fortunate, you have a bed warmer, a shallow metal pan with a long handle filled with hot embers from the hearth. You slide it between the sheets, move it around, and take it away before you climb in. The warmth doesn't last more than an hour, but that first moment under the covers feels like slipping into a stolen patch of summer. Some folks improvise, a heated brick wrapped in cloth, or a pot of hot stones placed at the foot of the bed. One particularly quirky trick involves warming a sack of dried beans near the fire, then tucking it under the covers. The beans hold the heat just long enough to lull you to sleep, though by morning they're as cold as the air. But here's the catch. Getting into bed is only half the battle. Staying warm all night means reducing the space your body has to heat. That's why many people sleep curled tightly, or even wrap themselves like a cocoon in the blanket. You keep your head under the covers too, breathing in the slightly stuffy, wool-scented air because it's warmer than the room. Your bed is also your fortress. You keep extra clothes within reach so you don't have to leap into the cold in the middle of the night. If the fire needs tending, you draw straws to see who will brave the frozen air outside the blanket first. Usually the loser is whoever's youngest or slowest to pretend they're asleep. And yet, there's something oddly peaceful about this space. The outside world is dark, the wind muted by the walls, the fire's glow flickering faintly on the ceiling. You can hear the soft rustle of someone shifting beside you, the quiet breathing of the animals in the corner, the occasional creak of wood as the cold makes it contract. You retreat from the fire only when you absolutely have to, and even then, it's to go to the second most important place in the house, the bed. Bed is a generous word here. It's really a low wooden frame, if you're lucky, stacked with straw, rushes, and maybe an old feather mattress if your family's done well. More often, it's just a heap of straw on the floor, pushed into the corner where two walls meet, so the wind has fewer sides to attack you from. The straw isn't exactly soft. You can feel the stalks poking through the thin linen sheet covering them, and every so often you have to stand up and shake out the bed to send the mice running. The smell is earthy, like a barn, which makes sense, because it's basically the same material used in the barn, but it's better than lying directly on the hard, cold earth. And then there's the great unspoken truth of the medieval bed. You rarely sleep in it alone. Privacy is a luxury you can't afford, and body heat is worth more than modesty. Your bedmates might be your spouse, your children, a visiting cousin, or even an elderly neighbor if they have no family of their own. It's a jumble of limbs and blankets where you learn to sleep while people breathe inches from your face. Historians still argue whether this communal sleeping was purely practical or if it also carried a cultural sense of closeness. But one thing is certain. When the outside world feels like an icebox, more bodies mean more warmth. You've learned to curl your knees into someone's back, to tangle your feet together under the covers, to steal whatever heat you can without waking anyone. The blankets are heavy, woven wool, thick and slightly damp from the constant cold. On top of that, you might have a fur throw, patched from scraps so that no two pieces match in color or texture. Sometimes people layer old cloaks or even spare tunics over the bedding for extra insulation. The goal isn't comfort, it's survival until sunrise. And here's where medieval ingenuity shines, the bed warming tools. If you're fortunate, you have a bed warmer, a shallow metal pan with a long handle filled with hot embers from the hearth. You slide it between the sheets, move it around, and take it away before you climb in. The warmth doesn't last more than an hour, but that first moment under the covers feels like slipping into a stolen patch of summer. Some folks improvise, a heated brick wrapped in cloth, or a pot of hot stones placed at the foot of the bed. One particularly quirky trick involves warming a sack of dried beans near the fire, then tucking it under the covers. The beans hold the heat just long enough to lull you to sleep, though by morning they're as cold as the air. But here's the catch. Getting into bed is only half the battle. Staying warm all night means reducing the space your body has to heat. That's why many people sleep curled tightly, or even wrap themselves like a cocoon in the blanket. You keep your head under the covers too, breathing in the slightly stuffy, wool-scented air because it's warmer than the room. Your bed is also your fortress. You keep extra clothes within reach so you don't have to leap into the cold in the middle of the night. If the fire needs tending, you draw straws to see who will brave the frozen air outside the blanket first. Usually the loser is whoever's youngest or slowest to pretend they're asleep. And yet, there's something oddly peaceful about this space. The outside world is dark, the wind muted by the walls, the fire's glow flickering faintly on the ceiling. You can hear the soft rustle of someone shifting beside you, the quiet breathing of the animals in the corner, the occasional creak of wood as the cold makes it contract. In a way, you're all in this together, humans, animals, even the bed itself, working to keep the night at bay. It's not comfort in the modern sense, but it's security of a different kind. You close your eyes, pull the blanket tighter, and feel the warmth of your bedmates bleed into you, as if you're all part of one stubborn, breathing machine refusing to freeze. Some nights, the bed feels like enough. Other nights, you need reinforcements. That's when the animals come in. In the medieval peasant world, your home is not just for humans. It's a shared shelter where cows, sheep, goats, and chickens sometimes sleep under the same roof as you. It's not as strange as it might sound. The animals produce body heat, and in a small, drafty house, that heat makes a noticeable difference. A cow, for example, is basically a living radiator. If you've ever sat near one in winter, you know the warmth that rolls off them in waves. Add a few goats, maybe a sheep or two, and suddenly your freezing cottage has a pocket of air that feels almost pleasant. Historians still argue whether peasants brought livestock inside mainly for warmth or simply for protection from thieves and wolves. But in practice, the result was the same. Everyone benefited from the shared heat. You get a warmer room, and the animals are spared the worst of the frost. Of course, this isn't exactly a clean arrangement. The animals bring with them the smell of hay, manure, and wet fur. You get used to it, or at least you stop noticing it after a while, and their noises become part of the nighttime soundtrack. The soft clink of a cow shifting her weight, the snuffle of a sheep breathing deeply, the occasional disgruntled cluck from a chicken disturbed in its sleep. The living arrangements vary. In some cottages, the animals stay in a pen at one end of the room, separated by a low wooden partition. In others, they're in an attached byre with only a doorway between the spaces. In poorer homes, the separation might be nothing more than a row of straw bales. The closer they are, the more heat they share. There's a quirky little trick some families use, placing a straw mattress directly above the animal's pen. The rising heat keeps the people in the loft warmer than those sleeping on the ground floor. It's not luxury. It's basically sleeping above a barn. But in January, you'll take whatever advantage you can get. And yes, you've learned to adapt to the oddities of sharing a room with livestock. You know how to keep your blankets pulled tight so a curious goat doesn't nibble on the edge. You've learned to keep your feet tucked in so a chicken doesn't decide your toes are a good perch. You've learned to ignore the occasional midnight snort from the cow, reminding you she's dreaming just as you are. It's easy to romanticize this now, imagining it as some cozy pastoral scene. You, curled up by the fire with your furry and feathered companions. But in reality, it's a mix of comfort and inconvenience. The heat is welcome, but the smell can cling to your clothes for days. The warmth is steady, but the noises can wake you just when you've managed to drift off. Still, in the grand balance of winter survival, a little lost sleep is a fair price to pay for not freezing. You've also noticed something else. The animals seem calmer indoors. They chew hay contentedly, their bodies relaxed, their breath visible in little clouds. In some strange way, their presence makes the room feel more alive, more awake against the cold pressing in from all sides. When you wake in the night, you sometimes hear the soft rhythm of hooves shifting in straw, or the muffled bleat of a sheep. It's a reminder that you're not alone in this frozen season. You're part of a small, stubborn collective, human and animal alike, huddling together to make it through to spring. You know what else fights the cold? Layers. Not just one or two, but as many as you can pile on without losing the ability to bend your elbows. Medieval clothing is basically an exercise in controlled overstuffing. The goal is to trap air between layers, because air, once warmed by your body, acts like insulation. First comes the base, a long linen shirt, soft from countless washings, though soft here still means a little scratchy compared to anything modern. Over that, you pull on wool, always wool, a tunic, maybe two if the wind outside is howling. The wool holds heat even if it's a little damp, and in winter, it's almost always a little damp. Historians still argue whether peasants had access to fine wool fabrics, or only the coarser, rough-spun kinds. But whatever the weave, wool is your friend. It's warm, breathable, and stubbornly resists freezing, unlike linen, which turns into a stiff board if left out overnight. Over the tunics, you tie a belt, not because it helps with warmth, but because it keeps the layers from flapping when you move. Then comes the cloak, thick, hooded, and heavy enough that you can feel it drag at your shoulders. If you're working outdoors, you might even wear two cloaks, one on top of the other, the outer layer catching the snow so the inner one stays drier. The hood is non-negotiable. It frames your face, traps your breath so your cheeks don't ache, and can be pulled forward when the wind decides to knife sideways. Sometimes you add a woolen coif under the hood, a snug cap that ties beneath your chin, to keep the heat from leaking out the top of your head. And don't forget the hands. Gloves are rare luxuries. More often, you wrap your hands in strips of cloth or tuck them into your sleeves. Some folks swear by mittens made from felted wool, which keep your fingers together so they can share warmth. You've tried working in them, but your grip on tools becomes clumsy. Warmth versus dexterity is always a gamble. Footwear is another battlefield. Thick wool socks, if you have them, go on first. Over those leather shoes or boots, though leather alone won't keep you warm for long. That's why you stuff them with straw. Yes, actual straw. It's surprisingly effective, cushioning your feet and holding in heat. The downside? It needs replacing often, or it starts to smell like a barn. There's a quirky trick some people use on especially cold days, wearing their clothes to bed. It's not exactly pleasant, you wake up smelling of sweat and smoke, but it means you don't have to shiver through those first brutal minutes of dressing in the morning. You just get up and go, already wrapped in yesterday's warmth. Of course, all these layers have a side effect. Movement becomes an art form. You shuffle more than you stride because the bulk tugs at your limbs. Your arms feel twice their weight, and bending over is suddenly an event worth planning. But when the wind rattles the shutters and the snow piles against the door, you're grateful for every scratchy, itchy, stubborn layer you've got. You sometimes catch yourself thinking about what would happen without these clothes, how the cold would sink in, numbing your fingers and toes, slowing your breath, and turning the edges of your vision gray. It's a thought you push away quickly, tightening your cloak around you. The layers may not be pretty, but they're the thin line between you and the cold's quiet victory. When the layers aren't enough, and some nights they aren't, you turn to the art of heating more than just yourself. The fire is your anchor, but you've learned ways to stretch its reach even after the flames die down. During the day, you keep the hearth fed steadily, not in roaring bursts, but in a slow, smoldering rhythm. Hardwoods like oak burn longer and hotter, though they're harder to split. Softwoods like pine flare bright but vanish too quickly, so you use them for quick cooking rather than overnight heat. In the evening, you bank the fire, raking the embers into a mound, covering them with ash, and tucking them in like they're sleeping children. This keeps them alive until morning, so you don't have to fumble with frozen tinder at dawn. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had access to fancy metal firebacks to reflect heat, or if such luxuries were mostly for the wealthy. But many poor households improvised with flat stones or even scraps of salvaged iron set against the back of the hearth, bouncing warmth back into the room. And then there's the clever placement of people. Sleeping close to the fire sounds ideal, but you know from experience it's a balancing act. Too close, and you wake up choking on smoke. Too far, and you're in the draft's path. So you work out the heat circle, the sweet spot where the air feels warmer without roasting you alive. Families sometimes rotate positions through the night, so everyone gets a turn in that coveted spot. Quirky little heating tricks crop up everywhere. Some folks heat stones in the fire and tuck them in baskets wrapped with cloth, carrying them around like portable radiators. Others hang a small cauldron of water over the embers, letting steam rise to keep the air from drying your throat, though you've seen what happens when the water freezes in the pot before it boils. You've even heard of warming ale or milk before bed, letting the heat work from the inside out. The first few sips are bliss, the last are lukewarm and questionable. But still, the ritual helps, not just physically, but mentally. It tells your body it's time to settle, to believe that warmth exists, however temporary. The hearth itself becomes more than just a heat source, it's the heart of the night. You and your family sit around it, backs to the cold walls, faces lit in flickering amber. You talk, mend clothes, repair tools, or simply watch the embers breathe. The glow draws your eyes the way stars do, hypnotic and slow. You can almost forget the icy darkness pressing at the shutters. Eventually, the fire shrinks to a quiet red glow. That's when you feel the temperature in the room change. A subtle shift at first, then sharper, like a tide going out. You pull your cloak tighter, tug the blankets over your shoulders, and remind yourself that the embers are still alive under their blanket of ash. If you wake in the night, you sometimes slip out of bed to check on them. The floor is cold enough to bite through your socks, but you crouch at the hearth anyway, stirring the coals until they sigh with light. The glow warms your hands for a moment before you bank them again, letting them smolder until dawn. It's in those quiet moments, alone with the fire, that you feel the strange mix of fragility and resilience in your life. You have almost nothing by modern standards, but you've learned to make warmth out of scraps, smoke, and patience. The cold may rule the world outside, But here, in the hush of the hearthlight, you've carved out a small, stubborn rebellion. Sometimes the fight against the cold begins before the sun even sets. You've learned that the trick is not just making heat, but keeping it from escaping. Medieval cottages are not airtight fortresses. They're more like well-meaning sieves. Gaps between wall planks, loose shutters, ill-fitted doors, all perfect escape routes for warmth and perfect entry points for the night air. So, you become a draft hunter. In the dim afternoon light, you run your hand along the edges of the door, feeling for the sly slide of cold air. You press straw into the gaps, wedge rags into cracks, and hang heavy wool or even old sacking over the doorway to slow the drafts. It's not elegant, but it works. Historians still argue whether peasants in colder regions routinely used wall hangings for insulation, or if such things were too valuable to waste on blocking drafts. In your case, you know the answer. If you've got a tattered cloak that's not worth mending, it's worth hanging up. A worn cloak on the wall can feel like a miracle when the wind begins its midnight siege. Windows, if you even have them, are another weak spot. Glass is a luxury beyond your reach, so you use oiled parchment or stretched animal bladder to let in light while keeping out the worst of the cold. In winter, you might not bother. Instead, you shutter the openings completely, sealing out not only the wind, but most of the daylight. The house grows dim, but it stays warmer, and in January, warmth is more precious than light. Floors are their own kind of problem. Stone or packed earth holds the cold like a grudge. So you cover them with rushes or straw, layering them thick. They muffle your footsteps, cushion your bare feet, and trap at least a little warmth. The downside? Rushes have a way of hiding unpleasant surprises, a forgotten bone from supper, a chicken feather, the occasional mouse darting between the stems. And then there's the bed itself. In theory, it's a safe nest of warmth. In practice, it's also a leaky container. That's why you tuck the blankets in tight at the sides, fold extra cloth around your feet, and even drape a spare cloak over the whole bundle to seal in heat. The fewer places your body heat can slip away, the better. You've even seen neighbors go further, building box beds with sliding panels so the entire sleeping space becomes its own insulated chamber. It's clever, though it can feel claustrophobic. But on a night when frost creeps across the inside of your door, a small enclosed bed suddenly sounds like heaven. There's a quirky trick some old folks swear by, hanging a curtain around the bed itself, even if the rest of the room is drafty. It's less about the thickness of the cloth and more about stopping moving air. The moment you block that current, the air inside your little enclosure warms fast. Still, no matter how well you seal things, the cold is patient. It presses against every wall, waits for every slip. You can feel it lingering just beyond the threshold, seeping through the smallest imperfections in your work. That's why you check everything twice before dark, and sometimes a third time if the wind picks up. By the time the last light fades, you've turned your drafty cottage into the medieval equivalent of a thermos, imperfect, patched together, but holding what warmth it can. You settle down knowing you've done your part, and now it's a matter of seeing whether the night respects your efforts. Food isn't just about filling your belly in winter, it's about fueling the little furnace that keeps you alive. You've learned quickly that the cold steals energy, and you have to put it back somehow. That's why, when the air outside feels sharp enough to slice, you start thinking about what's in the pot long before nightfall. By late afternoon, the hearth is busy with something bubbling low and slow. Maybe it's pottage, a thick stew of whatever's on hand, beans, peas, bits of carrot, some barley for bulk, maybe a sliver of salted pork if you're lucky. The longer it simmers, the richer it gets, and the more it seems to promise comfort. Each ladleful feels like it carries a little heat directly into your bones. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants in your part of the world had steady access to meat during winter, or if it was mostly for special days. In your case, the answer is clear. Meat is rare, and when you have it, it's salted, smoked, or both, lasting for weeks if you're careful. You shave off small pieces to flavor the pot rather than eating it outright. The taste of pork in your mouth is less about the meat itself and more about the memory it stirs: harvest feasts, weddings, days when the table groaned under more than cabbage and bread. Bread, of course, plays its part. Dense, dark loaves made from rye or barley keep longer than the soft white bread of the wealthy. It's chewy, sometimes a bit sour, but perfect for sopping up broth. Sometimes, when the bread grows too hard to chew, you soak it in the pottage, letting it drink up warmth before you do. There's a quirky little tradition you've picked up from an older neighbor: heating ale with a touch of honey before bed. It's not the sort of drink to make you drunk, but the warmth spreads through you slowly, softening the edges of the night. On especially cold evenings, you imagine it's working from the inside out, turning your stomach into a glowing coal. The cold changes the way you think about food. In summer, you might eat simply because it's time to eat. In winter, every bite is measured against the night ahead. You notice the small rise in heat when you finish a meal, the way your fingers feel less stiff, your breath less like a cloud. Sometimes, when you're lucky, you add something bright: a pinch of herbs you dried in autumn, a root vegetable pulled from the straw in the storage pit. These little sparks of flavor remind you that the world isn't all gray frost and smoky air. They're small reminders of the green season that will come again. And yet, you're careful. The stores must last. You know how quickly a pot of beans can vanish when the nights stretch long, so you serve portions modestly, keeping one eye on the pot for tomorrow's meal. The hunger of February is sharper than the hunger of December, and you want no part in testing which one you can bear longer. By the time you finish eating, the inside of you feels as warm as the outside is cold. You linger by the fire, cradling the last bit of your cup, savoring the steam. Soon you'll bundle yourself in layers and blankets, but for now, you've taken on enough fuel to meet the first hours of the night without fear. Of course, no amount of warm food or glowing fire stops the simple truth: winter nights are long. The darkness isn't just outside, it presses in, filling the spaces between your thoughts. You have to fill those hours somehow, or they'll swallow you whole. So you turn to the oldest tool you have: the stories you carry in your head. As the wind scratches at the shutters, you find your voice, low and steady, telling tales to anyone still awake, or even just to yourself. Legends of saints and kings, old village gossip stretched thin over the years, riddles you learned as a child. The words curl into the air like smoke, warm in their own way. There's a rhythm to it. You talk until your voice feels heavy, then fall quiet and listen. Sometimes you hear the creak of the rafters shifting in the cold, or the faint drip of melting snow from the thatch. Sometimes there's a knock, just a branch in the wind, but it makes you pause all the same. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly kept winter watches, small shifts of wakefulness to tend fires, check animals, or guard against intruders. But in practice, you found the night naturally divides itself into two sleeps. You wake sometime after midnight, stir the embers, stretch your legs, maybe share a few whispered words before settling back in. It's less a conscious watch and more a shared rhythm with the dark. During those waking spells, you might mend a tear in a blanket by the light of the coals, or stir the pot to keep it from sticking. On rare nights when the sky clears, you step outside for a moment, the stars crisp and sharp enough to cut your eyes. The cold seizes you instantly, but the silence is something worth braving it for. The snow glows faintly under the moon, the village still and sleeping, the whole world holding its breath. Inside again, you find your place among the warm bodies, family, maybe a neighbor's child whose own home is too cold tonight. The closeness is a comfort beyond temperature. You feel the slow, steady breathing of those around you, the shared rise and fall of the blankets, the occasional mutter from someone dreaming. There's a quirky game the younger ones like to play on these nights, guessing the time by the feel of the cold. They'll claim they can tell if it's before or after midnight by how the frost creeps into their toes. You humor them, though in truth, you sometimes wonder if they're right. The darkness stretches on, but the weight of it is different when you have things to fill it with: stories, quiet work, or just the shared knowledge that everyone else in the room is fighting the same cold, breathing the same fire-warmed air. And when sleep finally pulls you under again, you don't fight it. You've learned that in winter, rest is part of the work of surviving, of making it to the morning when the frost on the shutters melts just enough to let in a shard of daylight. Some nights, all your careful plans still fall apart. The woodpile shrinks faster than you thought, the food stores run low, or a sudden snap of frost pushes your cottage past its limits. That's when ingenuity steps in, or at least the stubborn refusal to let the cold win. You've patched clothes so many times they're more stitches than fabric. When a sleeve tears again, you cut it down, turning a tunic into a vest. Old garments become lining for boots. Worn-out hose become fingerless gloves. It's not about beauty. It's about squeezing one more layer of use out of something that should have died 2 winters ago. When the firewood's nearly gone, you get creative. Twigs from hedgerows, dried gorse, even twisted bundles of straw can burn if you pack them tight enough. Sometimes you trade with a neighbor, a jar of ale for a bundle of sticks. No one likes to part with what they have in winter, but most people would rather trade than watch someone freeze. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants regularly burned dried animal dung for heat, or if it was only a practice in certain regions. In your corner of the world, you don't argue, you just do it. It's not pleasant, but once it catches, the heat is real. And in the dead of winter, you've stopped being picky about what your warmth smells like. Quirky improvisations crop up everywhere. You've seen people stuff moss into the gaps of shoes, or wrap feet in parchment before sliding them into boots. Someone once suggested sleeping with a warm stone wrapped in cloth, taken straight from the fire's edge. You tried it, and while it cooled faster than you liked, it worked well enough to repeat. Water can be a trick of its own. Buckets freeze solid if left in the wrong place, so you keep them near the hearth covered with cloth to slow the ice. When you need to melt snow for drinking, you do it in small batches, because otherwise the fire spends all its strength just trying to turn ice into water. You've even learned to use the cold itself as a tool. Meat or ale can be stored outside, when there's no room indoors, safely chilled by nature's own hand, and if the ground's too hard to dig, you know where to find the shallow pits that were dug back in autumn for storage, a quiet reminder that survival starts months before the frost actually arrives. It's never elegant. Everything smells faintly of smoke, everything's patched or worn, and nothing ever feels truly comfortable. But you found a strange kind of pride in it. The ability to keep going, to make do, to find one more use for something long after it should have been thrown away. Because winter doesn't care how much gold you have in your dreams, only how much warmth you can wring from the scraps in your hands, and as long as you keep finding new ways to make those scraps work, the cold hasn't beaten you yet. The cold might feel endless, but you've learned it has patterns, small signs nature leaves for anyone paying attention. You've grown good at reading them, because sometimes they give you just enough warning to act before the worst hits. The moon, for one, is a quiet herald. You've noticed how frost seems heavier under a clear, full moon, when the night sky is sharp and bare of clouds. A pale ring around it often means snow within a day or two. It's not magic, at least that's what you tell yourself. But after enough winters, you've stopped doubting it. Animal behavior is another clue. The village cats disappear early into barns when deep cold is coming, curling into hay long before the frost forms on the windows. Chickens grow restless and cluck less. The geese settle in as if they know not to waste energy. Once you even saw a neighbor's dog try to bury itself under a pile of rags, and sure enough, by nightfall, the air bit hard enough to sting your teeth. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually forecasted weather in any organized way, or simply absorbed the signs by living close to the land. You lean toward the second. No one calls it science here. It's just what you do to survive. But the knowledge runs deep, passed along in quiet remarks rather than formal lessons. There are quirkier signs, too. Some swear the smell of the earth changes before a hard freeze, a sort of mineral sharpness in the air. Others look for the way wood smoke hangs. If it drops low and lingers near the ground, They say it's a warning of bitter cold. You've tried to smell and watch for these hints yourself, and while you're not always sure, it feels better to pay attention than to ignore them. When you do catch a sign, you act. You bring in extra wood, shake out the bedding so it traps more air, check on the animals twice instead of once. Sometimes it's as simple as making sure the fire doesn't die low before midnight or tucking an extra layer under the youngest in the house, but the signs also give you hope when they turn the other way. The first drip of meltwater from the thatch in the afternoon sun feels like a promise. The faintest smell of damp earth instead of ice means maybe, just maybe, the season is starting to shift. You've learned not to get too excited too soon, because winter likes to bite again just when you think it's finished. But still, those little cues keep you going. You've come to see the cold not as a constant enemy, but as a sort of teacher. It has its moods, its signals, its warnings, and if you're smart enough to listen, you can meet it halfway. You can't stop it from coming, but you can be ready when it arrives. Even if you've mastered the cold's tricks, winter has another weapon: illness. The frost can't kill you outright if you're careful, but the fevers, coughs, and aches that creep in during the dark months can. And in a village without a physician on call, you don't wait for help. You become the help. It starts small, a sniffle, a stiffness in the joints, the kind of tiredness you can't sleep away. Sometimes it passes. Sometimes it grows into something worse, the kind of cough that rattles through the night or a fever that leaves someone staring blankly at the ceiling. Your remedies aren't miracles, but they're what you have. Honey stirred into warm ale for sore throats. Onion poultices pressed to the chest for coughs. A strong-smelling mash of garlic and vinegar to drive out the bad air. You've even seen people hang sprigs of rosemary and juniper over doorways to keep sickness from crossing the threshold, a practice as much about hope as hygiene. Historians still argue whether these methods helped in any measurable way, or if they simply gave people a sense of control. But you know that even a little comfort matters when the nights are long and the body feels weak. One quirky trick passed down in your family is warming stones in the hearth, wrapping them in cloth, and placing them at the feet of the sick to keep their blood moving. You've done it enough to believe it works, or at least to know that warmth soothes no matter what the scholars say. Illness changes the whole rhythm of the house. Fires burn hotter, food stores shrink faster, and someone's always awake to tend the patient. Work outside is scaled back, neighbors drop by with broth or herbs, careful not to linger too long. The cold season makes people cautious. Everyone knows how quickly one sick bed can turn into 3. But sometimes, despite every effort, the winter claims someone. You've carried that weight before, walking behind a small, quiet procession through the snow to the churchyard. The ground is too hard to dig deeply, so the grave is shallow, and everyone works faster than they'd like in the bitter air. Still, most years, more people survive than don't. And when someone recovers, it feels like a victory over the season itself. The first laugh after a long silence, the first steady step outside into the crisp air, they're as much a part of survival as fire and food. Because winter doesn't just test your warmth or your hunger, it tests your body, your patience, and your ability to care for one another, and in those long, cold months, that care is as vital as any blanket. At last you feel it, the slow turning of the season. The mornings are still sharp enough to nip your fingers, but the light lingers longer each evening. The snow softens under the afternoon sun, trickling into tiny rivulets along the paths. You catch yourself pausing to listen to that faint, almost shy sound of meltwater, as if the earth itself is clearing its throat after a long silence. The fire still burns each night, but you let it sink lower now, content to wrap in blankets instead of feeding it endlessly. The woodpile no longer feels like a countdown to disaster. There's enough to see you through, and the constant gnaw of worry eases, just a little. Outside, the air smells different, still crisp but carrying hints of soil and damp hay. The animals sense it too. Chickens scratch more energetically, the goats push toward the door when you enter, and the cat begins leaving the barn again, stretching in sunbeams on the doorstep. Historians still argue whether the medieval hunger gap, the lean period between winter stores running out and spring harvests, was harder to bear than the deep cold itself. You can see why. Though the light is returning, your pantry is at its thinnest now, your options narrow. The rich stews of midwinter give way to thinner broths, bread made with whatever grain can be scraped together. But the promise of change keeps you going. You start tending small tasks for the seasons ahead, mending tools, checking seed stores, clearing patches of ground from lingering ice. These aren't the desperate labors of survival anymore, but the quiet preparations of someone who knows they've endured. There's a quirky village custom you've always liked. On the first day the snow fully melts from the church roof, someone hangs a green ribbon from the belfry. No one remembers exactly why, but everyone smiles when they see it. It's a signal, not just that the worst is over, but that you've earned the right to look forward. The nights are still cold, and the darkness still comes early, but no longer like a wall. Now it feels like a curtain you can see past. You've lived through another winter, and though you'll meet it again, you'll be ready. You always are. And now, the cottage is quiet. The fire is low, just a faint orange glow in the heart of the hearth, sending up a thin ribbon of smoke that curls and disappears. Outside, the snow reflects what little moonlight filters through the clouds, casting the world in a soft, silvery haze. The wind has calmed, its voice no longer at the door, but whispering far away over the fields. You breathe slowly, matching your pace to the stillness around you. The blankets are warm, the air is cool against your face, and the scents of wood smoke and wool linger in the room. Somewhere in the distance, a lone animal shifts in its stall, a reminder that life is still moving, slow and steady, through the night. The quiet feels earned, not just given, but won through all the nights of stoking fires, mending clothes, and waiting for the frost to break. You've made it to this moment, the deep of winter behind you, the edge of spring just ahead. The stars above are patient, watching without hurry. You let your eyes close, holding the image of that faint green ribbon swaying from the church belfry, a promise carried gently into tomorrow. Rest now. The cold is still there, but it's no longer a threat, only a presence you understand. Your breath joins the soft rhythm of the house, the rhythm of a season ending. And as the darkness settles in fully, you feel it, the deep, reassuring truth that you've survived, and you can do so again. Sleep comes easily now as the last embers wink out.